So hopefully you can all see the presentation view. So I'm going to introduce you today to an instrument that I've been working on in my PhD and show you some results. In line with this being an early career event, to share a little bit about me. Obviously, being a PhD, I don't have a particularly long career to share, but I'll show you where I'm up to, and then I'll present some kind of regular scientific results so we can all look at graphs and be happy with that again. Start there, I'm going to use this useful diagram of how I ended up kind of working in physical science. So I'm in the chemistry department in the University of Bristol. So really, in my formative years of education, I didn't think I wanted to be a scientist. I was actually home educated and spent as much spare time as I could working on a dairy farm that looked something like this. So it wasn't really on my agenda. I then progressed to kind of post-16 education and got involved in these subjects. So I guess that was when it was kind of written in the stars, even though I didn't really know it. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Still very much thinking I wanted to be in a hands-on career, sort of practical experience from the farming. Found this topic interesting, but didn't like academic kind of environments particularly. And then I took a gap year after I was 18 to kind of find out what to do, and I spent some time working at the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. In practice, I just spent a lot of time on Excel going through Scopus and ResearchFish data, which was really boring and actually inspired me to do something a bit more interesting and apply to university for a subject which I thought I'd enjoy. So I applied to do chemical physics at the University of Bristol, and I got a place. And I think you probably see here that I still didn't really know what I wanted to do, because I was just bridging between all the topics I used to enjoy. So I've used this color bar to describe what people think you do. So when you say I do chemistry, they think you pour a blue liquid into a test tube. And when you say I do physics, they think you're Brian Cox. I basically did everything in between that, and excluding the kind of synthetic end of chemistry and the astro and particle physics end of physics. So yeah, that was what my undergrad was. And then I popped out the end of that, still not really knowing what to do, but I got this email from someone who is now my supervisor, and I followed it up. I wasn't really having a lot of luck with the job search, so I looked into this, and I had pretty basic criteria. I just wanted to do something that was interesting, and every stage of this kind of application process I found a bit more interesting, and I really wanted to stay in Bristol, and this was offered in Bristol, though it's funded externally. So I ended up going to Paris to the funding body that were providing this studentship. So it's funded by a French nuclear safety organization. So I went over there and kind of presented myself and what the project was to them. I'm very happy to say that I was awarded it, and so that's where I've ended up today, still in the University of Bristol. This is my friendly screen of faces of what my research group looks at the moment, and it's a combination of, so my group is the Bristol Aerosol Research Centre, and the Institute for Radiological Protection and Nuclear Safety is the industrial funding body. So that's kind of where I am now. I'm in my third year, so kind of getting quite late into the PhD and sort of wondering about what to do next. I'm still in that position as I was maybe when I was 16, not knowing what I want to do, but I want to carry on doing things I enjoy. And from my PhD, I've really enjoyed the instrumental development, I'll talk a little bit about. And a lot of my project has been kind of learning what to make of this new kind of measurements that we're able to make, because there's no pre-existing data analysis method. And I'm happy to say I've enjoyed working with aerosols and all microparticles, and I really enjoy living in Bristol. So I guess that's a bit about me. So now I'll tell you about my project, and hopefully you'll see why I enjoy it. So I'm going to introduce my topic very generally, starting from spray drying. And in terms of formulations, this you'd come from the perspective of forming microstructured particles. That's typically a good way to approach it. So spray dryers very generally you atomize a solution into a hot environment, a tall oven of some sort, and you turn droplets into solid particles by evaporating the solvent. You can end up with all these kind of really exotic and interesting shapes, which can have a massive range of uses. So it's a big thing in the food industry, milk powder, coffee powder, flavors and juices, flavor encapsulation. It's a really big topic. This isn't an exhaustive list, by the way, but another big user of spray drying is the pharmaceutical industry. So they do a lot of powder production. So going into things like tablets, but also powders are a great way of drug delivery to the lungs. So it's of massive interest to those. This is the perspective I come from. So the nuclear industry, aerosols are hard to contain, and they're actually one of the primary sources of contaminated waste from a nuclear accident. So solids you can contain quite easily, liquids a little bit less easily, and aerosols are really hard to contain. So that's a big project for this industry. And a hot topic of 2020 and 2021 is airborne transmission of disease. Everyone wants to know about it now, and actually the physics and chemistry of this problem isn't particularly new. It's just we're now more interested in it when you add a virus into a droplet. So just to elaborate on the perspective of the IRSN, this is a fission product evaporator. So it receives nuclear waste. So from when nuclear fuel is spent, and then it's acidified and boiled down before it is vitrified, so solidified for storage. And in the event that one of these was to generate a leak, you essentially have a hot jet of aerosol particles or aerosol droplets, and understanding the processes that change those droplets into particles determines their transport properties. So how they travel through air, through filters, and through weather systems. And that's what my funding body wants to understand. So to rephrase that again, quite generally, typically, if you have any spray drying process, it will be comprised of these kind of main stages. And people are generally interested in the late stages here. So we've got particle properties, and you've got lots of particles. You have a powder, so powder properties. That's typically what we want to control in industry. We want to know what we're going to get. But to understand those, really, we've got to do the legwork here, and this is where my project comes in. So it's kind of we take a bottom-up approach, really, looking at how particles behave and understanding science in a general sense, and then we can take that onto more complex systems. So droplet evaporation, I'll introduce it very briefly. You can describe it quite well using what we call the d-squared law. So the size is a function of time. It depends on the starting size, and then this evaporation rate kappa. That depends upon the solvent properties and the environment that you dry your droplet in, and also the composition. So whether it's mixed or pure solvent and diffusion, internal diffusion, things like that. And then the particle formation stage can get really, really complex. It's super dynamic, and it's also coupled with droplet evaporation. So we can't resolve these processes separately. But some big factors in that are the actual solidification behavior of the solutes, or the arrangement of colloids if you have a colloidal system. And then again, the solvent properties and actually how that interacts. I guess, like I said, a large one is internal diffusion. And you can end up with loads of interesting shapes, like I said. So this is the approach we take to this problem. Like I said, we're using a bottom-up approach. So we want to understand the behavior of kind of single droplets, and then we can scale that to understand larger systems. So we want to study aerosol droplets, so free of surface contact. We want to be able to measure their size, so we can measure their evaporation, and ideally extract information like their density, their phase, and final structures. That's a kind of ideal outcome. And the way we do this in our experiments is we use a falling droplet chain instrument. So it has a monodispersed droplet chain. And that means we generate droplets at a regular frequency, and they're all entirely uniform. So you can't tell the difference between one from the other. And then we light this system stroboscopically at the same frequency as we generate droplets. And that leaves us with a standing image, and we know the time separation between two consecutive points in this chain. It's the reciprocal of the frequency at which we're generating and lighting them. And using this enables us to kind of view the whole droplet chain, so the entire evaporative lifetime, and then at the bottom of the chain we can collect a sample. So we get quite a good picture of what's going on with the droplets. If you're interested, I can show you a technical diagram later, but I've skipped over it for now, because I think that the philosophy which I just explained is enough to take it from here. So we take two primary measurements for this system. We measure an aerodynamic diameter. So this is defined from the settling velocity, so how quickly a particle falls. I just told you we know the time separation between positions in this chain, and we're able to measure the distance physically, so that gives us a settling velocity, so we can define an aerodynamic diameter. This is what gives us the transport properties and the filtration behavior. And additionally, we can measure a geometric diameter, which we do simply using bright field imaging and calibrate our image, so we know the size of one pixel, and we count how many pixels drop in our image, and we can just get these size from them. So here's the kind of data that we collect. Into the side of my instrument, I inject droplets, and I've plotted their trajectory here. Note that it's on a log scale, so they're not moving as far horizontally as it might look. So they decelerate horizontally and then begin to fall vertically at their settling velocity. And you can see the velocities slowing down here to their terminal settling velocity. Color scale this with time, so you can see the kind of different time regimes over which we're able to observe processes. And through everywhere where I take a measurement, we can also measure the droplet size, so aerodynamic and geometric size. So let's look at an actual chemical system. So sodium chloride, it's an ideal solute. It's well-known behavior and has well-known behavior in the aerosol phase, and it's got a really well-defined crystallization point. So at low relative humidity, it will form a solid in a very well-defined way. So it's a good system for us to begin to understand the phenomena that occur for drying aerosol before we look at something more complicated. And then we can go ahead and expand our understanding. So here's on the left the evaporative profile. So I've normalized these against their initial droplet size so that you can kind of make a direct comparison. And these droplets are drying in different relative humidities, so that we can compare the morphologies produced. 40% for the blue, 30% for the purple, and 20% for the red. And I've color matched the images here. So this is what they look like when they start, a nice homogeneous droplet. After some time, we start to see these optical disturbances, and that's nucleation events beginning to grow crystals. So these are the very beginnings of a crystal forming, or more than one crystal forming inside the particle. And then we see that eventually these begin to lose their circular kind of silhouette. So that shows us that we're running out of liquid in the droplet, basically. The crystals are beginning to protrude. Interestingly, these ones seem to remain in a kind of half crystal, half homogeneous form, so for the slower evaporation. And then we end up with a solid particle. So these are all free-falling droplets and particles that I've imaged here for you. So you can see we get these multi-crystal particles for the slightly faster drying, and then for the slow drying systems, you actually get a kind of really interesting single crystal structure. We can then take the samples we collect for SEM. So here's the single crystal particles. They're really reproducible and get this great kind of single square face, which you could see was on the top in the previous images, and then the curved face constrained to the droplet on the bottom. And then here's a multi-crystal particle from a faster drying event. So we can fit these into a kind of understanding of particle morphologies as a function of drying rate or evaporation rate. So we use a Peclet number, which compares the diffusion rate to the evaporation rate. And when the evaporation rate is higher than the diffusion rate, you get this surface enrichment occurring by kind of the solute or colloidal contents being kind of swept up by the receding surface. And that leads to surface enrichment and generates these more spherical, more crust or cage-like systems. So as the diffusion gets slower or the evaporation gets quicker, that's what we expect. I'll just quickly show you a kind of real world example. So a really useful example for my industrial funder is sodium fluorescein. It's quite a heavy kind of partially organic system. So it's used as a dye, a tracer in filters. So you stick it in one side of the filter and see what turns up green on the other side of the filter, and it tells you how good your filter is. Also in this, in the current pandemic we're in, it's being used a lot as a tracer for aerosol generating procedures in medicine. However, it's not an ideal solute. It diffuses a lot more slowly than sodium chloride, so we expect different behavior. And we really don't know as well what we're handling. It's a bit more of a kind of, let's see what we get experiment. So yeah, lots of range for any interesting results. Here's a trajectory like I showed you earlier. So you can see we took a nice experiment, and I've got an aerodynamic and geometric diameter plotted here. Once again, I've normalized them against the initial size. So you can see our droplets evaporate to a given size, and then the geometric diameter equilibrates. And that tells us that a solid particle, or at least an external shell, seems to have formed. Interestingly, though, we don't get the same transition in aerodynamic diameter. And this loss in aerodynamic diameter being much more gradual shows us that we're still losing some density, actually. So it means the mass of the particle is going down, even though its external size is not. And that shows us that solvent evaporation happens after this crust formation. And that's what we're able to resolve here. So this is a really interesting kind of result for the let's take sodium fluorescein as a generic amorphous system, which is much more applicable to things like the food industry, for dairy systems, and yeah, a good real world example. So with that, I'll just conclude. So we're able to observe and model. I didn't talk about the modeling today. Free falling droplet trajectories. We're able to take images and analyze their structure throughout this whole process with parallel measurements, and we're able to do offline SEM analysis. So thank you to my funders, the IRSN, and to my supervisor, Jonathan Reed, and all of my team at Bristol. Thanks for everyone for listening, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting talk. I can't see any questions in the chat. Oh, we got one. What volume are the droplets to start off with, and what about the concentrations of solutes that you have looked at?
Sure. So in terms of volume, we normally work in terms of diameter, so I'll just say that because I have those figures in my head. We're typically looking at sub 100 micron diameter droplets. So most experiments start around 50 microns or something like that, and we end up with sort of 10 to 20 micron size solid particles at the end. Hopefully, though, that's a fairly general theory that we're working with. And then the concentrations, we're typically quite low. So for us, a big challenge is working with these dispensers that make the micro droplet. They're very sensitive. So we typically start with a very dilute solution, but you can, if you evaporate a droplet slowly, kind of post droplet generation, end up with a much higher concentration. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you. And another very interesting question we've got is, can you modify the equipment and the methodology for molten droplets cooling?
In principle, yes. I think it would be kind of quite a significant work to the setup that I have. Yeah, environmental control is something we're working on at the moment. We typically work with room temperature and just control the humidity. But for example, I have colleagues who work with other apparatus that they work in kind of very cold conditions. So we could, in principle, start looking at things that would cool and freeze.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying I won't do it anytime soon.